Hello everyone, welcome to Module 4 of Philosophy 5350, Ethics. In this video, I'd like for us to take a look at some of the issues surrounding how do we pick which virtues are the right ones. So how do we decide? If we adopt a character-based ethic using virtues, how will we decide the appropriate list of virtues? Is there some authority that can decree it? Are they chosen by the dominant culture and are thus sociological artifacts? One of the ways to answer this question, a fairly traditional answer, would be to say, well, look, we're adopting the virtues based on the people around us that we see that are flourishing. So in the same way that, say, a wolf cub would watch its mother and father and other members of the pack hunt and carry out their social duties, we're like cubs, and we're watching the ones that are successful. And by living their life, they pass down to us the right way to do things, the right balance to strike between different character traits. Now, the issue with something like this, where you just say, well, go find yourself an exemplar and pattern yourself after them, is that very likely we will simply repeat whatever our society gives us. Which some things are good, some things are bad from our society, but different societies and different points in time pick different lists of virtues. So take, for example, and this one you probably noticed from last week, the idea of pride. So for Aristotle, pride is the crown of the virtues. Without pride, the virtuous person is incomplete. And from his perspective, it's pretty obvious why this would be true. If you're insufficiently prideful, then you won't think as highly of yourself as you should. You're a good person. You have all of these good character traits. You're wise. You're intelligent. You've struck the correct balance when it comes to things like temperance and courage and friendliness and justice. You know how to use your money properly and all. You seem to have everything going well for you. Well, why shouldn't you think that you're a good person? Why shouldn't you come to expect certain honors to be paid for you? And then if you don't receive those, why shouldn't you be offended for not being treated as you should appropriately be treated, which is at this very high level? Why shouldn't you look down on people who are less enlightened, less advanced than you? So Aristotle thinks that if for a good person, a virtuous person, not to have pride, they would in a way be lying to themselves about how good they actually were. We don't want that. We don't want people to lie to themselves. So Aristotle suggests we should have the amount of proper pride. Now, he thinks it can go overboard, like all of Aristotle's virtues. They're balancing points between two extremes. So, not enough pride would be, imagining yourself to be more modest than you are. And then too much, if you have too high a view of yourself, well, then it's out of proportion to how good you actually are. So if you had this the sense that you were a really great person when you weren't, well, that's also a kind of a lie as well. Or, maybe you would become conceited and constantly require everyone to pay attention to you at all times. Where Aristotle thinks that wouldn't be the case. Someone who, say, is a really good person, someone beneath them in the scale of goodness may not even notice, because it's not like as a person with pride they would feel the need to lord it over others or just overwhelm them with the show of their greatness or something like that. It just wouldn't be necessary. So Aristotle has some balance there, but he's quite adamant that pride is one of the virtues. Now contrast this with Christianity, which says quite the opposite. In fact, often pride is considered one of the chief or most important sins. So God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Pride goes before the fall. Pride is something that is punished, or at least shown to be foolish. It's not a virtue at all within Christianity. Humility is the virtue. So where Aristotle would say, you should be offended if you don't get the honors that are coming to you, Christianity would say, The first should be last, and the last should be first. When asked about who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, Jesus answered that the one who's the servant of everyone would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus himself, at the Last Supper, washes his disciples' feet, something that would have been done by the most lowly or insignificant servant. But here the creator of the universe washes the feet of his own followers. His followers, which will very soon scatter as soon as he's arrested. So Christianity seems to say the opposite from Aristotle about what attitude we should have for ourselves. Aristotle thinks we should have pride and look for ways for us to be honored and praised among other people. And Christianity says it's quite the opposite. We should not be looking for that. In fact, we should actively avoid it. So some of Jesus' advice here on humility is quite entertaining. He says at one point, if you're invited to a fancy dinner, don't go sit at the the nice place on the table, one of the more prestigious places, but sit towards the bottom of the table where no one important sits down there. You sit over there, and if someone wants to invite you up to come closer to the head of the table, then great, but don't start up at the head of the table, because most likely what will happen is you'll be switched out with someone more important, and you'll be embarrassed. And what did your pride get for you then? Nothing. So depending on which culture we're looking at or which belief system we're looking at, some of these virtues don't really seem to fit, or might be vices within another culture. Another issue that can happen is that your virtues can be too specific. So think of one for this, the one that I want my students to have, which is the virtue of studiousness. So studiousness would be the correct balance between studying too much, you're just stuck in your book and can't get out of it, you neglect all the other things in your life just because you're just trying to find the maximum amount of knowledge for yourself. And on the other extreme, the vice would be not wanting to learn at all, not being curious, not being interested, not being able to go look into something and try to find the truth, whether that's through a book or through some other kind of investigation, and not really caring about trying to find the truth. So studiousness would be this balance right in between. Well, for people that are living in an information economy, one that has the kind of leisure needed for people to be able to go search for the truth, something like studiousness makes a lot of sense. But not all people are in a situation like this. There are many people that are in terrible poverty, that can't afford to study, that can't afford time off to go investigate something. Their life would probably resemble something more like never wanting to learn, just because they don't have time. So studiousness, yes, makes sense if you're a student somewhere, or if you're working in an information economy like the United States or other modern democracies. But as far as something that applies to all people everywhere at all times, it doesn't really seem to. Other virtues, like the virtue of shame, well, this one only applies to young people, especially this is what Aristotle thinks. When you're young, the worrying about what other people think of you is probably pretty smart and keeps you out of trouble. But then as you get older, especially once you mature, that's really not a big deal for you, or it shouldn't be. The idea that someone else might disapprove of you shouldn't really matter that much. What should matter is, do you approve of the actions that you took? Do you think that they're worthwhile? Can you defend them to yourself? And if so, then, well, who cares what other people think? That's their problem. One way to illustrate this is imagine the same phrase being said by two people. Right? So the first person says the phrase, so they're both going to say the same phrase, but the first person says the phrase, "I don't care what anybody thinks," and they're 12 years old. All right, imagine a 12-year-old kid stomping their foot and telling the adults in the room, "I don't care what anybody thinks." I mean, at best, it's charming. It's kind of cute that they would do that. But this doesn't look like wisdom. It looks actually quite silly. What are you talking about? You don't care what anybody thinks. You're 12. You don't know anything. Come on. So that's one person. Now imagine the same phrase, I don't care what anybody thinks, but let's imagine, say, a 75-year-old person saying it. Someone with a lot of experience that's gone through a lot of different things in life, and they say to the people in the room, well, I don't care what anybody thinks. Well, now a totally different reaction. So, right on, Grandma, or right on, Grandpa. Like, good job. Yeah, we should be concerned about what you think. You shouldn't have to care about what we think. You've earned the right to have your own sense of what's right and wrong. You shouldn't be sitting around wondering or afraid that someone else might disapprove of you. You've earned the right to only care about your own opinion. So shame seems to be something that isn't universally applicable to all people. It's only something that applies at a particular time in your life, really only when you're young. Or for a third one, depending on the culture, and you probably saw this in the reading, the second part of the reading in the MacIntyre, this idea of fate, right? That one of your virtues should be the submission that you have to destiny. Whatever fate is set aside for you, you should be willing to just go along with it as part of, like, that's what makes for a good person, is not trying to resist fate, not trying to fight against destiny, but to let it take you wherever it is you're supposed to go. And I don't think very many people feel that way about fate or destiny today. This seems to be something kind of cultural about that particular society's beliefs in how history flows and where history is headed, where it's going. So these are some things that may be too specific. We wouldn't keep them. But what if we had virtues? What if someone proposed virtues that were in fact completely the opposite of the virtues that we might think of and celebrate? So a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche decided he was going to advocate for a reversal of all values. So what everyone else thinks was good, he would make the case that it was bad, and vice versa. So just a few examples from his work. He thought that human beings should have the virtue of cruelty, or in fact did, and that there's something about human beings that enjoys watching our enemies or those underneath us, those beneath us. Something about us enjoys watching them suffer. Now, this comes out in all sorts of ways. There's a desire for revenge that's part of our species. And sometimes this gets converted. We dress it up in fancy words and say, well, it's not cruelty or revenge. It's actually justice. That we, of course, we enjoy the fact that the people who do wrong are punished very severely. But that's not because we're bloodthirsty people, but because it's just, it's right for them to experience that. Sometimes, and depending on when this video is viewed, I hope this attitude no longer exists, but sometimes you'll hear people talk about the harsh treatment that someone will receive in prison from the other prisoners as being what's coming to them. So we're excited that you'll be horribly abused by your fellow prisoners because you had it coming to you. That's what you deserve. What you did was so bad that we're excited that you're going to be beat up by your fellow prisoners or assaulted in some terrible way. Well, this is the virtue of cruelty, Nietzsche would say. That this is something that, a strong people would want to have. Weak societies would look at cruelty and say it's evil. A strong society would enjoy punishing those who were against them. Another one is the virtue of destruction. We seem to, in this society at least, love creating, but in order to create, you must first destroy. And this power to turn into nothing, the accomplishments of others, is itself a kind of virtue, a kind of strength. Again, according to Nietzsche. So one society, when it takes over land from another might desire to deface all of its art or destroy all of its buildings, smash the icons that would be venerated by the previous society. And there's a enjoyment of that that's natural and good, to destroy, especially destroy the things that are made by your enemies. Another one would be revelry. So while Aristotle might preach the virtue of temperance, where you don't enjoy physical pleasures too much, Nietzsche would go the other direction and talk about the ability to let go of all polite convention in order to reconnect with a primordial chaos. And this happens maybe through festivals or drunkenness or exhaustion, that you're able to let go of the conventions that tell you how we should act and how to be polite and correct, but instead allow us to give full flower to the passion that's inside us. And then lastly on this short list that I've made here, domination, the enjoyment of bending others to one's own will. So feeling another person's powerlessness. This is seeing the world over through captivity of conquered enemies, of the enjoyment that, say, a boss or a supervisor might have in forcing people that work for them to do what they want the way they want it, and they treat them as just pure underlings. And there's something very satisfying, according to Nietzsche, something very satisfying about dominating others in this way, and that's part of our human heritage that we should enjoy and try to maximize instead of looking at with embarrassment. So why not these virtues? Why does Aristotle get to pick what the virtues are? Why not virtues like this? Why don't we maximize these elements of human nature instead of these other ones that Aristotle suggested? And then, of course, the really big difference that you would have is, and we hinted at this just a moment ago talking about pride, but what if your religious context has its own virtues to add on? So St. Thomas Aquinas suggested that in addition to the standard human virtues, the ones that have to do with our happiness here on earth, that Christians have an additional 3 virtues that have to do with our happiness in the next life. In fact, allow the happiness of the next life to blend into our happiness here. And so these 3 are faith, hope, and love. Specifically and especially love, in the way that we're commanded not only to love God, but to love each other, love everyone that comes into contact with us, regardless of their station or their ethnicity or their gender or anything else, that we are commanded to love even our enemies, and that this connects us more fully with eternal life and allows us to live a piece of that today. And the same goes with faith and hope, right? To believe the promises of God, to look forward to their fulfillment, that these are things that we can cultivate as humans, and they're part of our character that enable us to be not just good people, but transcendently good people, to become spiritually good people. And so these 3 combined with all the other ones that Aristotle would talk about, courage, temperance, generosity, and so on, that we would have these additional ones that are only available within Christianity. I hope this exploration was helpful to you as you go through the reading for this week and take a look at the videos, to try to think about how something gets accepted as a virtue and how we should try to adapt them to our lives. That's all for now. I look forward to seeing you all next week.